Oh, you're okay. You don't have to get the COSMERE books out. Hello, everybody. Today I am joined by my friend Jessie, who is not only a fan of the COSMERE, but a big fan of the MCU. Is there anything in the MCU that you haven't seen? I think you've seen most everything, right?
Yeah, I have seen, because I was thinking like all those Disney Plus shows. There's so many of them now, but I have seen them all. Yes, confirmed. I've seen every Marvel thing that's considered in the MCU.
Yeah, so she's kind of the best person I feel like to discuss this with. So I'll just start with the whole idea behind the video and something that a lot of people talk about, which is the COSMERE the next MCU?
Ooh, I like it.
What do you think?
It's interesting because I think Elantris was actually published way before the MCU was even a thing. And it's funny because I remember Sanderson talking about this when we did our interview with him and how he always kind of had this idea. And then the MCU came and basically it was like what he was doing with the COSMERE, and it made it mainstream, this idea that he already had. So I feel like the COSMERE was kind of already in the works before the MCU was even a thing. And so it's hard to say it's like the next MCU, because was it the MCU before the MCU was the MCU?
Oh, well, you could just say Marvel Comics might have been at first, and then it was COSMERE, and then it's MCU. But yeah, the idea of there being this interconnected universe and all these different characters that have the potential to interact with each other, and the further in you get, the more you're starting to see these Easter eggs. That's where a lot of the tie-ins are. So the thing that Jessie's referencing is we interviewed Sanderson. I'll have the interview links below. And it was really cool because Jessie, being a big MCU fan, did ask him a question that kind of had something to do with the MCU. And he was talking about how there was a while where his career hit a rough patch, and he actually didn't know if he would be able to keep going. I think he said it was around when the second Mistborn Era 1 book came out. And he had this idea for the COSMERE, but there was nothing to point to say this is what it's like. And it seemed very overwhelming, especially because you didn't have books talked about online the same way you do now. It wasn't as mainstream. And so that's a hard thing to promote purely by people going into the bookstore or people maybe on online forums and everything. It was much more niche and a lot harder to market. But as soon as the MCU really got big, that's what he could point to and say, it's like that in book form. So when we're talking about, is it the next, we're obviously kind of thinking about if the COSMERE does get adaptations, because it's looking like we might, and we can always kind of hope for it. He has made it clear that it would seem, at least for Mistborn, there's some things in the works. For a long time, it seemed like the things that might get adaptations weren't necessarily his COSMERE stories, because they weren't as easy to adapt, but I think we're starting to see more potential for it. But I think it does have the potential to be that next thing. I think similar to Game of Thrones, there's kind of this opening. Obviously, Game of Thrones ended where the MCU continues to exist. But for myself personally, I know not everybody's like me. There's a lot of people like you. For myself personally, I'm pretty tired of the MCU. I kind of want it to be done. So not because I don't like it, but because I think that what I liked about it originally, and the quality of the films, because it was originally mostly the movies, they've just kind of shifted into an area that's not as much my taste. And same with the Disney Plus shows. They're not as much my taste. I liked that we had more variety in tone between the movies versus the Netflix shows, because those were very different in tone from the movies. I liked that we had that variety, and now everything kind of feels like it's cut from the same cloth. It doesn't feel as distinct.
Yeah, even diehard MCU fans would agree with you. So you're not.
So I'm okay. Good. I'm glad that's not too harsh. But as a result, I think that there could be this place for there to be this next box office hit where people continuously are excited for the next one. And oh my gosh, now we're getting this one and now we're getting this one. So I definitely think it has the potential to do that, because especially with the stories in his COSMERE standing well on their own, and then there is that build up to essentially the Avengers level crossover. We haven't even gotten quite there yet, but it feels like we're getting closer and closer to that. Yeah. So I definitely think that it's one of those, you don't have to have seen every other thing in order to enjoy whatever is currently coming out. But kind of getting more specific, we both kind of think there's the potential for it to be. For sure. But what are some key similarities, and then what are some notable differences between them?
Ooh, I like that. Okay, so key similarities, I would say, obviously just the concept. So I was trying to think as we were talking through the first question, if someone had done something like this before. And I mean, comic books have been doing this for a very long time, but have there ever been like fantasy novelists or fantasy authors who have done something like this? And I had a hard time thinking of something, because it's more of, you get a lot of same world type of like continuations, prequels, sequels, spin-offs, all in the same world, like a Michael J. Sullivan, but you don't get this kind of very key difference being that it's separate worlds, it's separate casts of characters, it's separate settings entirely, that now have the potential to interact. So I think the key similarity between the MCU and the COSMERE is that it's that unique identifier that these are completely different worlds and times that are all converging, that don't have to take place in that same setting or with the same cast of characters over a certain amount of time. So the other thing I think is similar between the COSMERE and the MCU is the tonal differences you can experience with each different story, where, like you were mentioning in kind of the first phases of the MCU, they did this a little bit better, but they get to experiment with a lot of different tones and kind of subgenres of their movies. Like you got a little bit of horror in Doctor Strange Multiverse Madness. You get a little bit of a espionage thriller in Captain America Winter Soldier. You get all these different kind of flavors of a similar type of story and of similar tropes, but kind of with a different subgenre in mind. And it's the same kind of thing with the COSMERE, where you get to explore a little bit of these horror elements in Elantris versus such a deep focus on like mental health in Stormlight, versus a little bit of humor and coziness in Tress of the Emerald Sea. So you get to play with different tones and different kind of subgenres.
Something for everyone.
Yeah. So I think
while all still having a somewhat family-friendly feel, somewhat, because there are some that are less so. I think if Mistborn, if we were to make a direct comparison, Mistborn is more of like the, Netflix Daredevil, maybe, like the grittiness of it, you know? But I would say there isn't quite a parallel for Mistborn. But I also think, to kind of piggyback on that, you have the cool, almost superpowers, essentially, that our superhero movies give us. And these aren't superheroes, but in a sense, they feel like they are. I mean, they're notable individuals who end up having powers through investiture and things like that. And so in some ways, it's kind of like how Thor is obviously much more within the fantasy feel. And you're going to have the characters that have really, really, really overwhelmingly powerful powers in the COSMERE, and then you have the ones that maybe are not quite as powerhouses, but they still have something, kind of like a Tony Stark, where it's the technology that is really, So I think that there's that element. I think the COSMERE, one of the differences is the way in which it's kind of centered around different planets more so. And there's a lot more to almost a feeling of there being gods through the shards. It's not quite the same, but I think a lot of times the threats, aside from maybe something like Thor, it doesn't feel necessarily like the threats are just this person's. Well, that's not necessarily true, because I'm thinking Mistborn era too. Some of the villains are more like Tony Stark type
and I'm thinking
villains.
of like Eternals. I don't know if you've seen Eternals.
I didn't see Eternals
because that's where it gets a little bit more Cosmere like, where like the stakes and the level of villain you're getting is like god-like planet creating type entities. So it's starting to kind of like really get to those stakes, but I see what you're saying. It didn't start off that way.
Sure. And I'm not as into the later phases, so my references are always going back to some of the older ones and not as much. I feel like mine stop at like Spider-Man. The newer Spider-Man. But I do think too, so one of the notable differences is on surface level, there are these different subgenres, like what you were saying, that you get to explore, and then sometimes literally almost like a different world, or in some ways different dimensions. But I do think that some of the settings themselves in Stormlight are different in that it's less rooted in sci-fi, because I think an overall, if we're not talking subgenres, we're just kind of talking more of a main genre. I think science fiction might be a better way to categorize a lot of the MCU, with, of course, sprinkles of fantasy. And I think Sanderson leans more fantasy with sprinkles of sci-fi. The environments are not like ours. They don't feel as modern like ours do. And I think that could be one of the hurdles for the Cosmere being adapted. I know this isn't a video specifically about Cosmere being adapted, but if it were, and that's going to be a part of the conversation inevitably, I do think that that's one of the things that the MCU was a little easier. Like you're talking about Captain America. I mean, you don't, the Winter Soldier specifically, you don't have to do a ton when it comes to special effects, Whereas the Cosmere, if you're going to have it live action, you're going to need to do a lot more, which makes me a little nervous that it wouldn't ever hit that success level, because you're always kind of go into it and think, oh, it's not going to have the budget because it doesn't have decades and decades and decades of a fan base that already loves it, and we're already accustomed to that superhero subgenre. There's household names. So I don't know, maybe, but it does make me a little nervous that it being more fantasy than sci-fi, that that's where you see some split.
Yeah, I think, just the MCU being rooted in our world. I mean, of course it goes off planet, and Guardians of the Galaxy is different planets and all that. But I mean, at the end of the day, it's very like Earth centric, very like Western,
our solar system.
Even like America, just in general, it's like very America centric for the most part. There, of course, there's notable exceptions, but like for the most part, that's it. So it makes it, you have a low fantasy setting that's already so much easier to adapt. So yeah, it's going to be an uphill battle to adapt the Cosmere, but I think they have the ability to do it now, especially if you like see the latest Guardians movie and like some of the settings that they create and some of the things they have to do for the MCU, and just like the Rings of Power level. I mean, well, that budget was absurd, but that kind of visual, it's possible now. So they could make it look good. It would just be a lot of money.
I think another big difference is that obviously the MCU has its roots in the comics, and it takes inspiration from different story arcs from the comics. So really it's taking those characters and it's kind of picking and choosing. And I know, my husband Sean is a big fan of parts of, like, he likes Hickman's Avengers, which apparently is absolutely wild. And it's different from how they've adapted it. Civil War was a lot grittier than it was in the movie. So
yeah,
I think that because it had these household names that it was pulling from, and then the bits and pieces of the story, you didn't quite have to be as true. Because it's not like there's different Vins. It's not like there's different Kaladins. You have one. Right. You have one chance to get them right.
That's true.
And you can't really do all the different versions of Spider-Man. You can't really redo these same things. So if it's going to have success, it has to do it right. And obviously there's always going to be some comic book fans that are going to be displeased with how certain things are adapted. But I think you're going to have people really upset if the COSMERE isn't adapted as accurately.
That's a great call. Yeah. Like there's so many times they've had to redo the Spider-Man comics. So of course when they adapt it, they can pick and choose whatever they'd like. That's a great call out. Yeah.
I do think though, Sanderson, I would imagine, would be very involved. I don't think that he would ever, I don't think he wants, from what I've seen of him discussing it, an adaptation if he doesn't have a fairly critical role in adapting that material. I have seen him discuss, or I haven't seen it in depth, but I've kind of seen mentions of him talking about with a Mistborn adaptation, that he's worked through a script that is pretty much an exact adaptation of the books. And then so doing that to screen, he's done something that's kind of a mix where he's changing some things. And then he's done something that's the essence of Mistborn, but then changed pretty much for screen, where it's hardly the same story, but it feels like the same story, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
And that makes me nervous. I'm like, I don't want that. And I don't think you have that same issue as much at this point with the MCU.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
So I don't know. The MCU just kind of it had a lot going for it to adapt it and not worry about the rabid fan base being upset when something wasn't perfect.
Right. Yeah.
I do want to know though, in your opinion, if the COSMERE were adapted, would it always be considered the new MCU in the same way things are the new Game of Thrones? You know how when Game of Thrones ended, every new fantasy thing was, is this the new Game of Thrones? And because we've talked about the COSMERE, it's not like you and I were the first ones to do this. Mm-hmm. The fandom has been saying for a long time, and Sanderson's even pitched it as it's kind of like the MCU and that there's these connections. But if it were to be adapted, would it ever kind of escape the shadow of that and become its own thing? Or do you think people would always be comparing them, and sometimes in a way where the COSMERE doesn't have the chance to be its own thing? It has to always kind of try to incorporate things to please people and think about the marketing of it all.
Yeah, I think it would take a long time to get to that point, right? Because I think the MCU started with Iron Man, and they teased that there could be something bigger here going on with the Iron Man end credit scene. And I think at the time, no one could have predicted the
scope.
Scope that the MCU would eventually have, and the wild success it would eventually have. And I think it's going to probably start the same way with the COSMERE, where you start with what hopefully is a very strong introduction to the COSMERE, right? It most likely would take the form of Mistborn with an adaptation. That would be your first. And I think you probably wouldn't really do anything that would indicate that it is interconnected to anything else yet, because you guys,
I'm like weirdly getting the chills just thinking about this. Is so weirdly like obnoxious book fan behavior, but I am just imagining watching it and seeing whoever the actor is that plays Hoyd pop up on screen and being like, oh my God, you know, and then like the next time there's that same actor. And for the people that don't know, that are like, wasn't that guy in that other one that was based on? Yeah, and just like totally keeping lips sealed. And if all of the fandom kind of collectively were to shut up about all of the connections, you know what I mean? Where like you let the new people in.
Let it happen.
Just let it happen. Don't like be that eager person to be like, actually, and then telling everybody. Obviously, there's going to be conversations about it online, things like that. Like we're talking about it right now. But just the idea of being able to see that and then getting excited when those tiny little things drop and those little references are made. It's kind of like, I remember really distinctly when, and I thought this was a smart way to do this with the Netflix shows, when they would mention something about like the event, when they're referencing what happened in Avengers. And I thought that was like the perfect way to tie in that it kind of is in the same universe without worrying about bringing in other people, just being like, oh, there's that little thing there. But to hint at maybe eventually, because as we talked about at the beginning, thus far we haven't seen an Avengers level crossover. So we're still waiting for that. So if we then got to see that unfold on screen also, I think that would be really cool. But you're right that it's not as blatant.
It would take a while. And I think, yeah, you have to do it through Hoid. Hoid would be your Easter egg that would start to kind of tip people off that this is going to be something a little bit bigger. But I think it would take a long time. And I think the thing I do think the COSMERE would have going for it more so than the MCU. I think the MCU is kind of in a awkward spot right now. It's not in the best spot with the fan base. But like you mentioned at the beginning, each COSMERE story stands so firmly on its own. It really can just be enjoyed on its own. And if that might eventually change as we get more crossover. But the MCU is kind of now in this pitfall where if it doesn't connect to something else, people are disappointed. It's like,
yeah,
well, how is this playing into the bigger story? So I think one thing that I would want the COSMERE to avoid is that pitfall, is repeating that same mistake and having it be something where fans are going expecting a ton of crossover and connections and it playing into this larger arc. And then it disappointing because it doesn't do that to the extent that the fans would hope for. So each of these new movies seems like, what's the point? Because it doesn't feel like it's leading to any sort of bigger event. But I think the COSMERE has an advantage that each story really truly does stand on its own. It doesn't have to do that. So I would almost want it to really take its time with doing that and not overdo it. Right. I think that's the problem now with the MCU a little bit.
I do think they're in kind of a rock and a hard place situation because I know for Sean, he's of the mindset, I feel like I can't watch anything now without watching all these other things. And that's frustrating for him because, and I know it's frustrating for a lot of other people too, because there's certain characters or certain arcs of the MCU, I guess you could say, that are just not everybody's cup of tea. But this idea that you have to watch them all to be able to appreciate something else, it is asking a lot.
It is.
But I do wonder, though, this is making me now very curious. We know that Sanderson sometimes is good at like keeping things close and not letting people know until all of a sudden he has this excitement, like he did with the Secret Projects, where he wrote 4 books, and then suddenly it was like, guess what, everybody? I wrote 4 books. So he's been kind of hinting at Mistborn having an adaptation. Do you think that he would do a similar thing that he did with the Secret Projects, that he would be like, I've been telling a lot of you that Mistborn is in the works, and guess what? And then like letting everybody know, and you're all like, oh my gosh, this is amazing. He's like, what? Wait, there's more. And then he's talking about how like this thing is going to also is in production. This thing's in production. Like, do you think he would do something like that so that you could see them come out? You know, one comes out at the beginning of the year. You see another one come out over the summer. Then you get one at the beginning of the next year. So like, do you think he would do the Secret Project treatment to announcing?
I mean, if he had the opportunity to, he totally would.
That would be so exciting.
So up his alley. I just don't know that would ever be a thing he could do.
He'd have to have had so much. I don't know how he would keep that a secret, because I feel like somebody involved would say something.
Yeah. But yeah, that you did bring up a point I wanted to chat about on this chat, which was the problem that you're having. Again, I think the MCU, the one pitfall right now is fans feeling like it's kind of directionless, and these standalone stories are not satisfying because we've now had such large crossover events. So nothing can kind of live up to what came before. But the other problem is what you said about fans, like the average moviegoer feeling like they can't watch the movies without having
or Disney shows.
Right. Like my dad, he went to go see Guardians of the Galaxy. He's seen the other 2 Guardians of the Galaxy movies. He's seen Endgame. He hardly remembered Endgame. And he was like, Jesse, I'm confused. Can you explain to me why Gamora is acting a certain way? Because I just am so confused, and I'm like, okay, sit down, Dad. Let me explain the whole thing to you. Because so you're starting to now get where casual fans can't enjoy it.
Yeah, I actually saw. Oh, I'm so sorry. Go ahead.
Yeah, no. So you're gonna lose people because of that. So I think Sanderson's in an interesting spot because he can see the MCU doing what he wants to do very well, but then he can also see what it's not doing so well.
It's kind of like how he was, I think, a producer for Wheel of Time, but he wasn't really, and they like asked him to look over stuff and he'd give his notes. They didn't necessarily always take it. And he could just kind of watch and be like, what do people hate? Okay, don't do that. Don't do that. Right. Don't do that. They do like this though, so do that. So he's kind of just been like lurking a little bit, make sure. Because I do think that he's of the mindset of I probably could have had things adapted in the past, but I'm not going to do it if it's not going to be good, if I don't have enough creative control. I just don't see him. He does not seem like the kind of person that's just happy to have an adaptation. You know what I mean? Which not to say that other authors, like that's all they care about or anything like that. I just think that he seems like he would want to really, really be involved. And he also seems like the person that would pull a plug on the project if it's not going the way that he likes. Because I feel like he wouldn't do something if he didn't think it was going to be good. What I was going to say, though, a second ago, is that to your point about people, you mentioned everything with Gamora. I saw a post where the actress was saying, like, this is her last movie as this character. And the comments were really funny because some people were like, she needs to stay. She committed to this. And then other people were like, she's still in it. But I thought, and they're because they haven't gotten far enough in, like, I don't want to say too much, but they're like, wait, I thought, I'm confused, you know, like,
yes.
So there is a lot of, and it's very easy to get spoiled too.
Yes.
Because you see certain actors that you're like, I mean, they're still around. So
yes.
kind of,
yes. Yeah. Oh my gosh, you just said something that I was gonna go back to. Oh, about Sanderson being picky with his adaptation. I can totally get why Sanderson would be picky. First of all, he has a lot of properties that could be adapted and could be very successful if adapted correctly. But I think the risk you run is being someone like, I think in the fantasy community, he's obviously humongous, right? But it's not like a Twilight level.
I'm just thinking about that article being like, if he's so popular, why is no major publication sorry. Anyway, sorry to derail it. Keep going. It's not Twilight level.
It's not Twilight level, like right where like your mom and dad know, like, oh yeah, Twilight. Like my mom and dad are like, Brandon Sanderson, who? That's great. Woohoo. Glad you like him.
Yeah. If you're not in the fantasy community, you don't really know about it as much. Yeah. And it's not as simple. If you're trying to describe the plot, it's not as simple as like, there's vampires living among us. You know, it's not that. It's, well, so like some people can digest metals. But that's specifically in the world of, or like in Scadrial. That's different if you're in, you know, Roshar.
Like it reminds me of like, I always think of the Aragon adaptation, right? Like Aragon was like popular in the fantasy community. Not everyone and their mother knew what Aragon was, but it was like very popular in the fantasy community among kids. That got the adaptation that is probably one of the worst adaptations. And they still haven't done anything else with it. I think it ruined its chances to ever get.
I heard that they were going to do another one. Is
really? Are they really? I mean, widely.
Like I thought they were going to redo it. I thought. Which,
I don't know.
I could be wrong about that. Maybe. If that's true, because I remember thinking at the time, unless I made all this up, I remember thinking at the time, it gets another chance before other books get even one. Sorry, my glasses are dirty.
It's like a perfect example of like, that is the risk you run if you just settle for like any adaptation. Is like, you might not get a second shot, and you might not get something else by you adapted if something hasn't been proven to be successful. So, you know, I think some properties are probably protected from that. I mean, I think of like Harry Potter, Twilight, like Percy Jackson is gonna it's gonna
Another
do
one.
well. So like some of it's protected, but I think Sanderson does have a risk to run here where if he's not careful and he just settles, he might not get another shot. So it's gotta be good. It's gotta be the perfect adaptation.
I was thinking he has a pretty good chance, kind of going back to this and then something I said at the beginning, where I was talking about how the COSMERE is more fantasy than sci-fi, which the MCU, I think, arguably is more sci-fi than fantasy. Depends on what era you're talking about and which parts of the MCU you're talking about. But it being more about our own world makes it feel a little bit more science fiction. And the magical components don't really happen until later. So anyway, I'm speaking very broadly, but Sanderson's works are fantasy, but they're kind of a blend. And I think a good thing is that what I was saying before about how with fantasy adaptations, you so often see like, is this the new Game of Thrones? And as fantasy readers, we're like, not even a little. When you're talking about some fantasy stuff, you're like, they're just both fantasy. That doesn't mean it's the next. It's not Game of Thrones. It's not in the same in tone, in magic, in time period-esque type things. So it's so different from Game of Thrones that I don't think it will draw those comparisons at all, which is nice and refreshing because I feel like people are excited about fantasy adaptations now. They're willing to give them a try. They are more legitimate in people's eyes than they used to be. So I think there's that. There's a willingness to give them a try. But I also feel like people, even outside of the fantasy reader community, but people who are willing to watch fantasy adaptations, they're tired of all the somewhat Game of Thrones-esque or Lord of the Rings-esque fantasy stories. They, I think, are also craving something different. So if you tell someone like, what if you have a fantasy story, but it has an MCU element to it? I think people will be like, that sounds cool. And you don't really have to say anything else.
Right.
And just let it be. So I think that's a plus to go against kind of to balance out. You're talking about some of the things to watch out for and be careful with. That's kind of on the opposite end, something that's got going for it.
For sure.
Another thing, getting into more specifics, how do you think the characters compare? You can talk about characters like specific characters or just generally speaking.
I was thinking about this a little bit when we were talking about similarities and differences, and could I say the characters are either similar or different? And I had a hard time because both of them have such large casts that you just have to draw really broad strokes here. I think they're more similar than they are different because I think at the end of the day, they're a hero archetype. I think Sanderson's main cast of characters are heroes, and they are sometimes reluctant heroes, which we see in the MCU. Sometimes they are go-getter heroes, but at the end of the day, they are heroes. And I think that that's something I love about his stories is that he has these hero archetypes. They aren't like the morally gray thing that is like
maybe like Dalinar Vin, but not to the same degree as the Game of Thrones characters.
Right. Like I would not like if I'm going to make a list of like best morally gray characters, Sanderson's characters probably aren't going to fall in them. And same with
weirdly his villains might fall in there, but not as much. The heroes aren't usually. I think Dalinar is an exception.
Yeah. It's the same thing with the MCU main cast of characters. They're heroes. They're good guys. They're not the morally great. I mean, sometimes, you get into the like Civil War era stuff and it gets a little bit more interesting. But at the end of the day, again, I'm drawing with really broad strokes here. They're heroes and they are morally good. You're
overall.
Yes. So it's like, I think they're more similar. And I think that I think people like that. I think that's a lot of the draw and the appeal for me with the MCU. I like these hopeful type stories, escapist type stories following good people doing the right thing, coming out on top. I like it. And my dad always makes a joke like, "Oh, did they win? Did they win at the end? Did they win?" Like, "Yes, Dad, but it's how they won that makes it fun."
That's really funny. I feel like your dad and I would
Yes.
have fun talking about movies and things together. Because the first part of Endgame, I seriously sat there so annoyed because I'm like, because it ends and then there's the next part, and I'm like, oh, are things gonna somewhat resolve in the next one? Like, there were people that were like crying and devastated. I'm like, why are we all devastated? We know that they're gonna fix this problem in the next one. But yeah, it's the journey before destination. So I do think, though, to your point about, I think a lot of people like the morally gray characters also. They like following villainous, horrible people. There's plenty of shows with that. And there are, of course, the superhero types. I think people are interested in that hero type character without them literally being the same superheroes we've seen over and over again.
Yes.
So I think that would be refreshing to see a new take. It's not the same origin story done a little different.
Right.
Like, because I know it's not MCU. It's the other, it's DC. But like, how many Batmans have we gotten at this point? How many Supermans have we gotten at this point? So I think that people would be eager to be like, I don't know this character's backstory. And it would be really exciting and engaging. Like Kaladin's arc.
I know. I just think of Kaladin.
Is so good. And I think so many people, just like him, the first Bridge run, that hopefulness with Bridge 4, I just know people would love it.
Yeah.
So I think that would be really exciting. However, I think that there's almost like a certain amount of time where people are really into the heroes, and then people get sick of the heroes. They get sick of like, oh, everybody's so vanilla, and they want the really morally gray, somewhat villainous characters, and it shifts. And I think we're currently in we like the heroes because everything that happened in 2020 was so hard on the world, and everybody was so stressed, and we kind of like, I feel like that's why we've seen these cozy fantasies have such success, because everybody's kind of just in the mood to be happy and they want the good guys for once. I'm tired of the bleakness. I feel like in that mindset, not of course literally everyone, but I feel like as a trend.
Yeah.
But if it's too long by the time the COSMERE starts to happen, I feel like people are going to be like, oh, look, another superhero. You know what I mean?
Yes.
Because you see, and you were talking about how tonally, and we were saying this in the similarities, there is this sense of like there's an element to family friendliness depending on how far they go with certain things. Maybe like PG-13, perhaps not rated R, is what I'm trying to say.
Right.
But even in that article that I referenced a bit ago, where the guy said something like, all the good guys are really good and nobody ever has sex, or something was what the author said of that article. And you're like, yeah, it's not Logan, right? Logan is that like outlier of like, yeah, that one's super adult, and I do like that a lot, but that's not what this is. It's a little different from that, and if that's not your thing, that's fine. But we do get into phases where we kind of all make fun of the good guys for being good.
Mm-hmm.
So I guess weirdly I'm like kind of worried about that now. That by the time it happens, if it happens, that everybody's going to be sick of the good guys.
Yeah. I think of like a good example of like a morally gray MCU character. Best one of my favorites, Loki, right? I think Loki is a very, very popular character in the MCU.
I actually think just Tony Stark. He starts out so unlikable. He literally makes weapons pretty much of mass destruction, right? I mean, and didn't Stan Lee have something about when he first made Tony Stark, he was trying to make an unlikable character that everyone liked? Something like that, right?
Yes.
And I think Loki has kind of fulfilled that same thing, to your point.
Yes, exactly. So I do think that there's potential. I will say, the one thing that I could see, the MCU is not known for having the best villains. And I do think that the COSMERE, when I think of villains, I don't really think of any COSMERE like story villains as like a favorite villain of mine. So I do think that maybe there could be potential for like the villain problem that the MCU has.
That's a good point.
But
I think, you know, not that I disagree, but I think that there's room to not have this. If you get a great actor to play Toral Sadius, if you get a great actor to play Straff Venture, like if you can get people playing them, I feel like weirdly, because you know, Straff, he's just so like just gross. You know what I mean? Like Sadius is interesting because he weirdly I mean, they're both interesting characters that I would love to see adapted because I think Sadius fulfills their kind of like perfect Alethi, like the culture says that this is how we should be, and Sadius kind of fulfills that. The person that's constantly in pursuit of more and having that, doing whatever it takes to attain, you know, power. And so like he fulfills all of what they value, but that doesn't make him good. And so I think he's interesting. But then Straff Venture is just horrible, but he's horrible in a compelling way. I think, like, let me rephrase. He's not that compelling. He is hateable. I feel like you get a good guy to play him and you're like, I hate that guy. Because I weirdly think,
I love the hate thing.
Yeah, I don't want to say too many specifics because I know not everybody who might watch this knows all of the details of the COSMERE, but when Straff Venture gets his time to shine, I feel like him as a villain is more interesting than some of the other big bads. In Mistborn. So I feel like he would be kind of the not that they're the same character, but just like interest level and what he's willing to do and the violence that he's willing to commit reminds me a little bit of Kingpin. You know what I mean? Where he's got people in his pocket, or he's, you know what I mean? He's got people that are like kind of working for him, and then you wonder, like, does he have some spies? Does he have dirt on someone? And Sadius kind of similarly, although they're very different types of villains. But to your point, like I think the really big bads, they're more like apocalyptic type antagonists in a way.
And I have to say, like, what I do think that the COSMERE has going for it more than the MCU is the Sanderlanche is a real thing. And the endings of some of these stories are so mind-blowing. And so clever and such a big twist that it doesn't even matter if you have like the best villain with like, you know, the most compelling kind of story. It's like it's such a fun, like
exciting.
Yes, it's like unpredictable the way you find out how everything ends and blows up, and it's just like the MCU doesn't really have, like, you know where it's going. It's not like a big twist comes in and you're like, oh my god,
the who's gonna make it through this element. I think there's actually some pretty intense stakes that a lot of times are sort of missing in our superhero type of stories. Now
no one really, it's like kind of like the joke, right? Like none of like the main characters die
until they're ready for like the actors to be off and to like focus on other characters. I was gonna say, now I'm just stuck on the villains. Amaram. Oh my gosh, Amaram would be such a good character to see adapted because he's just like bleh, you know, you're like, I hate that guy.
Oh my gosh. Yeah, there's definitely some like good ones that I don't think like yes, you're right. They are
small scale though.
They're like the smaller scale villain. When I was saying that before, I was thinking of like the broad, like the big baddies.
Lord Ruler.
Yeah, Lord Ruler, and then Stormlight.
Odium.
So yeah, I mean it's like, but those are really great characters. So,
do you agree or disagree with the idea that Sanderson's good guy characters tend to start lower, not like Elantris, because Raden's like a prince, but he does end up having some pretty devastating things happen immediately. But still, well, I guess Warbreaker too. We haven't really talked about Warbreaker much, but I'm thinking Vin and Kaladin because they're kind of the most well-known. Do you think they start from much lower circumstances and thus they don't have just the average person who gets powers kind of feeling like Spider-Man has, right? You have that like just the kid living in the city and then he gets bit by a spider and now he has powers, right? You don't have that feeling that I think a lot of people, especially young people, can kind of imagine themselves in that scenario, right, where you can't really imagine yourself as Kaladin. So it almost like, does that take away from, I guess, meeting that, put yourself in their shoes for a younger audience? I definitely think it's compelling more to adults. But I wonder if you're a kid, I don't know that maybe, I don't know. I haven't been a kid in a long time.
I mean, so. I think it would never be for a kid. I don't think that they would ever have a Kaladin birthday party the way they have a Spider-Man one. For a kid, that was so much what I loved about those types of stories. I think more of Sailor Moon, but for comic book character, being able to picture yourself with those powers, right? And playing imagination, if I were Sailor Moon, or if I were Spider-Man. So I don't think it's ever going to have that appeal, but I do think you could loop in a younger audience with still the
cool factor.
Cool, yeah, just the cool factor. Kaladin gets to do so much cool stuff. Vin gets to do so much cool stuff, and I think the other thing is, I mean, you have to think that Spider-Man's so popular with kids because Spider-Man's a teenager.
Right.
And the fact that kids still love Iron Man, I see kids dress up as Iron Man and he's
that's true. He doesn't have
man.
He has very adult things going on. It's kind of being a womanizer and a billionaire.
He's a very adult man. And you have little kids dressing up as him. So there is a possibility of them, having fun with pretending to be those characters. But I don't think it would be to the same extent ever with some of these comic book characters because of that factor. Like you said, you can't kind of put yourself in their shoes.
I do think that kind of on the flip side, they have such an amazing underdog story, both of them, rising from the bottom, that rise takes it. It's a larger amount than you see with, because Tony Stark, we're saying, I know we keep going back to Tony Stark. There's obviously other characters, even with Black Panther, he already kind of has this really awesome, he has a lot going for him, right? Mm-hmm. Whereas, there's, of course, we're saying with Spider-Man, he's more of just a regular old teenager going to high school or whatever. But they're not starting out as slaves, and they're not starting out as And then of course with Warbreaker, it's a little different because you're looking at
royalty
people and royalty, and so but there's just so much that might be appealing to people, so many different stories.
Exactly.
So I think the characters' arcs, even though they are all cut from that cloth of the hero type, their arcs are very different. I think.
Yes, I totally agree.
Goes back to what I was saying before about that. I then think makes their origin stories even more compelling and exciting because they're not the same as what you usually see.
People love an origin story, so seeing an origin story of something we haven't seen before would be very nice.
It'd be so cool. So another thing, would it be across? This is just us theorizing. Or maybe instead of would it be, it's would we want it to be across mediums and platforms? But by platforms, I mean, some are on Disney Plus. We'll just throw that out because the MCU is Disney Plus, but things are released in theaters a lot of times. Different mediums. Are we going to get video games? Are we going to get animated versus live action? That kind of stuff. I have always said, and people are free to disagree because I know some people just don't like animated, but I'm I need them to be shows, all of them. I need all of them to be shows, and I need all of them animated and I also need video games, specifically for Mistborn. Maybe you can get a good Stormlight one too, but Mistborn really needs a video game. But what do you think?
Well, so I'm coming from a different perspective because I don't watch animated shows really ever.
Jesse, you need to watch Arcane, darn it. You need to, when you do, I'm not kidding. You need to set aside like 2.5 to 3 hours to watch the first 3 episodes. Okay. And then you need to message me and tell me thank you. Because you're going to be like, I can't wait to watch more. Anyway, sorry. Go ahead.
Yes. Well, I am coming from a different perspective. And I also don't play a lot of video games. I play like Pokemon. So I don't think that really counts. So for me, what I think would have the most mass appeal is live action. Yeah. I think there's absolutely no way Stormlight could be movies. So I think the only thing that could be movies is Mistborn. Even then, I still think I would prefer TV shows, but they have the most potential as movies, the way they're structured. So I think most of them I would want, I would personally want all of them as TV shows, and I would want all of them live action. I think that would just have the most mass appeal, the most potential. And then, I mean, you could always do, once they're released, like you could always have like Mistborn video game as well, which I do think a Mistborn, like I would play Mistborn video game for sure. And like MCU is doing What If. They're doing animated now. Now it's
well, like, and the Miles Morales.
So that's technically not a part of the MCU.
Oh, is it not? Really?
Yeah.
Oh, because it's through Fox or Sony. Okay.
Yeah. So it's technically not a part of the MCU. Kind of like I guess maybe there could be crossover because they're starting to do that with like Venom. There's like a little bit of, but Sony properties technically aren't like proper MCU.
See, this is why I needed this chat with you, because you can like be like, Elle, you're wrong. Okay.
Yeah. But I mean, you do bring up a great point with Spider-Verse, which is, even though the first one didn't perform well at the box office, it got such amazing reviews and it ended up doing so well on streaming. And I think that the second one, it'll be interesting.
It's also cute and delightful, and the animation style is cool, and the music is great. It's one of the better ones.
Amazing. Yeah. So I am curious how the second one does, because that gives us a good indication of whether or not animated can truly be like very, very mainstream for like a wider audience, like not like your typical kids movie type animation, that like, can we get it to an adult audience?
Yeah, that is a connotation that goes along that, if it's animated, it's for kids, and
it's super inaccurate. Like they're like you said with Arcane, with a lot of these animation, like they are not for kids. So
Castlevania is so not for kids. Yeah.
So it's definitely like what's the word I'm looking for? Perception. It's an inaccurate perception. I don't know. I'm losing the word I'm looking for. Yes. But I do still think it would have the most mass appeal as that.
I agree. I think, like, selfishly, because I do love animated things, and I think you don't have to worry about, does the fantasy look weird? Does the magic look bad? You don't have to worry about any of that. And then you can make all the characters look exactly like how they're described, especially because some of the features of like the Pershendi, I could see if you get a great budget making them look amazing, but you have to have so many of them because they're like a whole army's worth. And we saw in Wheel of Time what happened when we needed to have the Trollocs. When you needed a bunch of them, it was like it looked horrible. Sorry but I thought it looked terrible. So I don't want that to happen, right? But if you can do old school Lord of the Rings orcs type of makeup and everything on all of them, but oh my gosh, I can only imagine that would be so time consuming, and there'd be so many makeup artists and everything you'd have to employ. They'd have to probably sit in their chairs every day for hours because the Parshendi would anyway. But if you could do it well, I think live action would be so compelling, and there's such great places that I think fit the description of the Shattered Plains. So I think, like I said, selfishly, I would love it to be animated, but you're right. And this has been brought up so many times. Live action just has currently the most mass appeal. I do still like the idea of having a combination, like you said, of getting these shows, but then also having video games to go along with them.
And I mean, you could eventually do like animated spin-off type things like the MCU's kind of doing now. The one thing I will say, this is a huge notable difference between MCU and COSMERE is if you want if you want to do the COSMERE stories right, I think it's really hard to fit that into a movie. But that was like the MCU bread and butter. Like that was the whole inception for it, was the big blockbuster movie, the big event that everybody got to go to together and experience together at the premiere screening. So if you don't kind of have that same experience where it's like the movie event of the year, is it possible to get on the same level? I mean, obviously it is, because of what we saw with Game of Thrones. That was like every Sunday, tune in, it's the big party. We would all have our friends over and it'd be the big thing. But that's harder to do with a TV show. So it's going to be harder to get that initial.
Yeah, maybe a tiny bit of pushback would be, and I haven't even watched it yet, but the success of The Last of Us.
I haven't watched it yet, but that is a good point. I forgot about The Last of Us. I haven't watched it.
I know that video games are enormous. The video game industry, the fandom for video games is enormous, and that game did really well. So what I'll add is that I think people are more willing to kind of listen to what fandoms are saying is good. Like, not that we're all objectively correct, but if there's because The Last of Us had a lot of recognition and praise among gamers. And when gamers were there's some stupid criticisms of the show from gamers, because sometimes game fandoms can be ridiculous. But when gamers are like, no, this is good.
Yeah.
I think people are actually willing to listen because video games are more respected now. And I think, isn't it that movies and the music industry combined are still not as big as gaming? Something like that. Gaming is really huge. But I think with the success of things like the MCU and Game of Thrones, I feel like if you have, which there is this enormous fandom for Sanderson, when you have a bunch of us that are like, no, it's really good. You have so many videos online, so many discussions. You have all these like Reddit threads. The Kickstarter got trending on Twitter. So even though people, like you were talking about before, your parents, or my mom might not know that much, somebody has mentioned him probably to a lot of people,
right?
So,
and I mean, you do make a good point that I would want a weekly release for.
You would? Oh, I don't know if I could handle it.
I don't want it. I know the one thing that comes to mind as a notable exception is Stranger Things. That is like when that drops, everything else goes out the window.
I'm a marathoner, though. You know this, Jessie.
I want to be able to, but the problem is, the COSMERE stories are so fun to theorize. It would be much fun because there's so many twists and turns and reveals that it would be so fun to have it as a weekly release where you get to like.
I know, and you know what? This is why I know that Mistborn probably is going to be a movie, but to your point, there are so many moments in Mistborn where like a chapter ends that I can visualize that being the end of an episode.
Yes.
Like I could name off so many right now, but again, I don't want to spoil things if somebody hasn't read Mistborn. But oh my gosh, there's certain moments where it's why it's compulsively readable, like why you want to keep turning the page. Yeah. And I think you would have that same thing if you did those weekly releases. And then of course, us all big brats can be like, tee we know. Yeah.
I feel like there would be so many fun things to like chat about each week and theorize for people who haven't read the books, like what's gonna happen. Oh, it'd be so fun. I love a weekly release.
And then each week, everybody, of course, all the fans are going to be making videos about the episodes, which that actually would probably do really well for ensuring that it's successful, because the fandom is going to be talking about it.
And people that maybe creators like us, we just have so much potential content.
So we've been talking about, I'll have this be the last prompt for today. I know there's so many other things we could talk about. So I think we already kind of addressed this. Is the Cosmere being novels rather than comics a pro or con for mass appeal? We kind of already dove into that, so I might skip it if that's okay with you. Is the Cosmere not having the same level of fandom a pro or con? We touched on this a little bit because we talked about there have been, at this point, there have been, I think, decades for Sanderson, but not the same amount of time. Comic books on these notable characters, even if you hadn't read a comic, you knew these characters, right? And I don't think that's true, obviously, for Sanderson's characters. So do you think that the level, even though it feels big when you're in it, it's still not anywhere close to the comic book fandom level and just like general knowledge? Because you had the animated shows and things too for our generation. Do you think that that's going to be a con, or do you think it's a good thing because you don't have to worry as much about pleasing the fandom or upsetting the fandom?
Yeah, I just think what we talked about before about how comic books are inherently at an advantage for an adaptation because they've been redone so many times. The characters have been redone so many times. So it's like if you have a certain version of that character that may not match maybe the comic book arc you read, you are more understanding because you're like, oh, they could be pulling from multiple versions of this character.
Your dogs have something to say too.
Yeah, and I'm like, can you stop? Because my daughter's sleeping. So don't wake her up. So I think like that right there is like it's so hard to compare the two because I think it's a con that the Cosmere doesn't have that same advantage. Like you mentioned, if you are going to adapt Vin, you're adapting everyone's same version of Vin.
Yeah.
And everyone has an idea of what Vin looks like, acts like, walks like, because we've all read the same exact Vin. So I think that's a con. But I think the level of fandom, like the popularity of the stories, I think it's a pro. I think it's kind of fun that a ton of people would be getting to experience these origin stories for the first time and would be getting to theorize about like twists and turns and reveals for the first time, not knowing what's coming. You'd be less prone to spoilers. You'd be.
That's true.
I don't know. It might be kind of fun. So
I think another
barrier of it's a barrier of entry for getting it, adapted. But I think it would be good.
I think a pro. Well, I want to actually tie in the one I said I would skip because you kind of were mentioning this a little bit too. One of the pluses of it just being a set of novels and not having these different versions is that if people want to read the books, you just point to the Mistborn trilogy, you're like, don't read second era, read first era. That's it. That's all you got to tell them, or like if it's an adaptation of Warbreaker, you're like, here's Warbreaker. You don't have to tell them, well, it's pulling from a little bit this version and also this version too. And like, you don't have to worry about that. So it makes it easier if people see it and they like it and they want to get to the books.
Yeah.
But on the level of fandom, so I do think there are plenty of issues within every fandom. And that's true of the Sanderson fandom too. I do think the Sanderson fandom is a relatively decent fandom. I mean, I think the Stormlight fandom specifically can be not okay because they have bullied people before who don't like Way of Kings. And you're like, hey, get a life. When they do that, I just think it's totally unacceptable. But I would say the overall Sanderson fandom, which incorporates, non-Cosmere too, it's a pretty nice fandom overall. The bigger a fandom gets, that percentage of people that aren't kind increases. And so by it not being too big, I think that also makes it a little more welcoming because if you are going to get obnoxious gatekeepers and things like that, which the Sanderson fandom isn't really like that. They seem very much like, please come join us. But you still have less of the obnoxious part when it is smaller than something like Marvel. But I think another example is Witcher. I didn't really like the Netflix show. I haven't really liked the Netflix show. Obviously, I love the video game. That's how a lot of us came to read the books. But the Witcher fandom is enormous because, like we talked about before, video games are really big. And the amount of just unnecessary, horrible things that were said to the actress playing Yennefer because she wasn't white, or people like sexualizing the character that plays Ciri when she started out really young when she was first starting the show. You know, like that kind of behavior that sadly is true for a lot of things. You're going to get less of that when the fantasy works, not the fantasy, the fandom is a little smaller. Yeah. So I think that's a pro. I think it's a pro.
I won't make Marvel content for that reason. I'm afraid. I'm afraid to make Marvel content of trolls, of people who are more knowledgeable than me about it. You know, like I'm not a diehard comic book reader. I watch the movies, I watch the shows, I've caught up on all of them. I think I'm a pretty big fan, but
I will say, I think that the Sanderson fandom does not have this issue, which a lot of other fandoms do, of the like, that chick's just pretending to try to get guys to like her. That's not a thing in this fandom. You know, like,
yeah,
it's just not a thing. It's a thing that's in a lot of things that have its origins in comic books, like what you're talking about. And it's much better than it used to be. You don't really have that issue, or you do have that issue heavily with video game things. It's getting better also, because it's mind-blowing to realize that what's between your legs doesn't dictate what kind of stories you like. I know, it's crazy, but it's true. What? So I think people are aware of that a little bit more now, which is nice. Oh. I didn't want to end this on a sassy note. I'm trying to be positive. I'm saying that I think the Sanderson fandom is not that way. So you don't have to deal with that, which is good. So a con, I guess, just that I think that if you're doing an adaptation of something and it's huge and you please the fandom, if it's big enough, you're like, as long as they like it, it's going to do well. But with this, you can't just please us. You do have to have that mass appeal. Like we were talking about, you can't just do an animated adaptation because it might not reach the levels it needs to keep going. So I guess that is the con. There's not enough of us that we collectively can make an adaptation successful.
Yeah, exactly.
But fingers crossed we do. I mean, this is all hypothetical. I know,
fingers crossed that we actually get an adaptation at some point ever of a COSMERE story. That'd be nice.
I know, again, this isn't the topic, but part of why a video game would be cool is because I feel like there's less pressure to actually adapt the story. And you can just adapt the world and the magic systems. And do cool, like, just playing as some random character. Yeah. I know the Lord of the Rings games would do that. You would just, like, be an elf in Middle Earth. You know, it wasn't quite. Cool.
That'd be so cool to do for Mistborn. Oh my gosh. I would totally play that.
You're an Allomancer, you know, like you're a Misting.
Right.
And you have to, like, get a group together or something, like you pull a heist, you know, something like that would be pretty
and you
cool.
See your little levels of all the different metals that so you have to ingest the metal.
Yeah, you thought you were a Misting and it turns out you're a Mistborn, so you're learning all the different powers as you go, and so it would be awesome. I can make a whole video about how I would want the video game for Mistborn to be, and like the play style and everything. Gosh, it's a silly camera. Focus. Anyway. Were there any other things you wanted to add before we?
No, I mean, we hit all the things that I was hoping we would talk about, and I'm like so happy we were able to chat for so long about it because this is such a fun topic. I love it.
I could see it being really fun if we came together again to talk about like dream fan casting and things like that. Wouldn't that be fun?
Oh, I'd really have to like think about it. I'd have to prepare. I'm not good at that, but I do want to do that. That would be so fun.
There's an actor that I just feel like would be the perfect Breeze. That when I hear this person talk, that is how I hear Breeze talking. Is this actor's voice? And there's a completely unknown actress that I'm like, that's Vin. I'll have to send you a picture of her.
Yes,
like that's Vin. And then I'll have to tell you where she's from because it's such a random thing. She's really, truly. And she's young too. She's, I think, only a teenager right now or something. So
that's good for Vin.
Yeah. But as far as some of the other ones, I'd have to also think about it. But that could be really fun. And if it were animated, we could talk about like a voice actor that we think could be great. I mean, think about who would be a voice actor for Dalinar. You know, you'd have to have some really cool big voice and stuff. Yeah, that'd be cool.
Oh, so good.
So we'll have to come together. If anybody ends up, watching this, let us know other topics that you think would be fun for Jesse and I to discuss. And let us know your thoughts on a lot of the stuff we said. If you are somebody who is a big comic book person and you've read a lot of the Marvel comics, you have other things that you would want to point out that maybe her and I didn't get into, let us know your thoughts. But anyway, this was super fun. I'll have Jesse's channel linked, and we'll see you all later. Thanks for watching. Bye. Bye.